Good morning. Something very ironic. First of all, do you know the old song, "Make new friends but keep the old"? Do you know that one? New are silver but the old are gold, or something like that. This is a song my wife really liked when we had to move too much. I was thinking of it this morning because one of my favorite, I guess philosophers is a fair word to use, is Søren Kierkegaard, a man whose writings influenced me profoundly in my mid-20s when I read his Either Or Volume 1, not realizing that he was role-playing, and I read the Don Giovanni description. My mind was exploded. And if anybody is bored with opera, get your hands on Either Or Volume 1 and read Kierkegaard's analysis of Don Giovanni. It will blow your mind. So Kierkegaard, I think of as sort of an old friend because I'm snobby that way with books I read. I'm really resentful. Has anybody here ever read anything by a scholar about C.S. Lewis? I resent people like that. I grew up on C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is my friend. What are these scholars doing writing about him? That was my initial reaction, because how many of you feel like that when you read Lewis, like you're reading the works of a friend? He's got this very personal voice, right? You feel like you know the guy. Well, anyway, so Kierkegaard is an old friend, and then I just was introduced to a new person that I feel a need to get to know, and that's Dietrich von Hildebrand. I mean, what an amazing story, right? Who doesn't want to be like him? Now, here's an irony for you, though. You've just listened to a talk about a philosopher that was really interesting narrative with a few applications. And now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to subject you to a long, boring lecture about analytical stuff, and it's going to be trying to be practical. Get that. So you've listened to a story about a philosopher, and now you're going to get a boring practical talk. Makes no sense. Matthew Arnold was a poet in the 19th century, and he had this an educator, by the way, too, very influential educator. His father founded the rugby school from which we get rugby, soccer, and football, so you can thank Matthew Arnold's dad for that. He was well-educated, classically educated as a child. I'm pretty sure he was fluent in Latin and Greek by the time he was about 15, I think, but don't quote me on it. But as an older man, he wrote this poem. He wrote this verse. He said, "Rigorous teachers seized my youth and purged its flame and cleansed its fire, showed me the high white star of truth, there bade me gaze and there aspire." Now, on the other hand, about 400 years ago, a British advertising chap was thinking about how he could remake the world. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to change the world and all that sort of thing that radicals are into. I guess he didn't have time for his neighbors, so he had to change everything. And so he came up with a new way of thinking about knowledge. Not entirely new, but basically new in terms of its impact on culture. And if my slideshow is working here, no, it's not. Yeah, there it is. His name was Francis Bacon, and he said in Latin, "Scientia potentia est." It's got a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Scientia potentia est. Anybody know what it means? There's some Latin teachers here. What does that mean? Not knowledge is power, right. It means knowledge is power. Now, I've spent, 30 years thinking about that phrase. What does Bacon mean when he says knowledge is power? And I want to propose to you that in that phrase right there, whether he meant it to be this way or not, the way this phrase has been used, what you see in that phrase right there is the undercutting, the pulling out of the linchpin, the unraveling of the fabric of classical education. Scientia potentia est. Now, I have to defend that because I just made a really gigantic claim. And here's the great news for you. In this really long, boring speech, I do only have till 11 o'clock. And that means that I have to use all sorts of caricatures, and I have to generalize, and that gives you permission to completely qualify and disagree with everything I say. But it also gives me permission to overstate the case about everything. So here I go. I'm contending, in the modesty and humility and reverence of my character, I'm contending that Francis Bacon said something there that shouldn't ever have been said, and that changed the game radically. Whether he meant to or not, I can't say. But let me defend my case briefly. What Francis Bacon has done in this phrase is not just said, and please notice the distinction, he doesn't say, if you have knowledge, you get power. He doesn't say, knowledge gives you power. Okay? He doesn't say, knowledge enables you. He says, knowledge is power. And of course, it depends on what the meaning of is. Those of you who are really old remember that big controversy from the 90s. But it does matter what the meaning of is. And I don't know what the meaning of is was when he said that. But I can tell you this, that the way people have taken this phrase over the last few centuries has led to it meaning knowledge and power are, what's the term Thomas Aquinas would use? It's a great Latin word that we use in English, and I think it starts with a C. Convertible. Knowledge is convertible with power. Same thing. It's the same thing. Now, when that comes across the ocean to America, it's formulated in a very elaborate philosophy called pragmatism. And John Dewey argues, for example, as the chief spokesman for his version of pragmatism. I don't know if anybody else holds to his version of pragmatism, but certainly the ideas contained in it spread. And in his version of pragmatism, as I understand it, John Dewey basically says, knowledge in the old-fashioned sense, knowledge in the, I'll say classical, he would have said Aristotelian sense, is not attainable. Doesn't exist. It's a delusion. Because you see, in the classical tradition, people like you and me, people like you and I, we have a hang-up. We have an obsession. Grammar. No, we have an obsession with this crazy notion that there's permanent things, that some things are eternal. But according to Dewey, Darwin has proven that nothing is eternal, nothing stays the same. And so, he says in his essay on the impact of Darwinism upon philosophy, which is about 12 pages long and the easiest thing he wrote to read, you can get it free online, I highly recommend it. In that essay, he argues that knowledge in the old-fashioned sense doesn't exist, but we still have the furniture in our mind of that old way of looking at things, and we need to escape from that. We need to get rid of that. Of religion, he says, no religion has ever come up with anything creative. Philosophers come up with ideas, and then shortly after that, a religion will mythologize the ideas and make them permanent. So Christianity is basically Aristotelianism turned into a myth. That's a simplification of what Dewey says. So then what is knowledge to Dewey? What is knowledge to Francis Bacon? In all my readings of Dewey, I haven't been able to find a really clear, specific definition, so I'm going to offer you one that I think he wouldn't object to, that I think he would accept, and that is, knowledge is the ability of an organism to adapt to its environment. I think that's a fair way to put it. Now, if it's not, I do think that it's a way that it's been applied. Knowledge is the ability of an organism to adapt to its environment. Well, what is knowledge in Aristotle? What is knowledge in Plato? What is knowledge in the Christian tradition? What is knowledge in the Jewish scriptures? What is knowledge in virtually every other society prior to at least Bacon, if not Dewey. What is knowledge? I would suggest to you that it's a mystery, but fundamentally it's this. It's the soul's perception of reality. In the ancient world, and really throughout the Middle Ages certainly, and to this very day, there's this intuitive sense that the soul, that first of all, that we have one, that we have a soul, it's not material, and it can perceive, because it's not material, it can perceive non-material things. Right? Like truth, like goodness, like beauty. These are like justice. I mean, has anybody here ever seen justice? I mean, perfectly embodied, perfectly expressed. Have you ever seen the perfection, real justice, if I can put it that way? I haven't. I've tried to attain it a little bit in my life, and I haven't done a terribly good job, but have you ever seen a perfectly just act without any qualifiers? Well, if you haven't ever seen it, how can you say it exists? Now, what the tradition has long argued is that the soul perceives it. We know that it's there. One way that you can assemble a concept of justice, and this is very important, in modern thought you would turn to something like constructivism. Perhaps you've heard of the idea of constructivism. It's a very powerful idea. The notion ultimately, probably, again, I'm caricaturing, but the notion is that the individual child constructs his own reality, right? That's where we get things like true for you, true for me. The individual child constructs his own reality. Now, I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea that a child has to construct his perception of reality, but that's a little different from constructing his own reality. But if we look at knowledge as power, knowledge as adaptation of the organism to its environment, knowledge as practical utility, ultimately, if that's what we see as the essence of knowledge, then where does the soul's perception of justice come in? Where does the soul's perception of any truth come in? In the last talk on Dietrich Hildebrandt, John Henry mentioned this thing he called an intuitive power. Did you hear that phrase? An intuitive power. If you believe in the soul, then I think you have to believe in something that is intuitive. You have to believe in an intuitive power to grasp, to perceive. The student of Hildebrandt, has anybody here ever had to read Heidegger, by the way? Or had the privilege of reading Heidegger? Personally, I find him absolutely fascinating. I understand occasional words, rarely a sentence, but I really like reading because there's something sublime in the experience of sitting in the presence of something that incomprehensible. But what he says, what that student of Heidegger said, is that when he studied under Hildebrandt, his ears had become more discerning. That's intuitive. His ears had become more discerning. In modern, I'm going to say popular thought, if not elitist thought, if we want to go that way, academic thought, I think there's a tendency to devalue the intuitive and to devalue ears that are discerning. There's a tendency to do that. I think we're probably getting past it, but there's a tendency to diminish, to devalue discerning when it comes to academic work. Sorry, not discerning, but intuition, feeling like this fits or doesn't. But in the end, I'm trying to figure out what else would be a foundation for knowledge. We heard in the last session again about how Hildebrandt thought that reverence expresses itself in our conceptions of sexuality, and I was struck by the fact that Hildebrandt felt that a scientific approach to sexuality, let's just say, was inappropriate. That when you look at issues of sexuality based on, I'm going to use the word research. By doing the research, you've altered what you're researching, is the way I would put it. You have to accept the mystery of things. And because we don't have a sense or a belief in the intuitive, we don't have a cultural agreement on the intuitive, we have to come up with some other way to get along publicly about things, and we've determined that that other way is research. Statistics, data. But what is the foundation of research? I read an article about 2 years ago, and I found it again and posted it on Facebook recently, about somebody who researched the research in education. You know how education is all research-based, research-driven curriculum, the research-driven pedagogy? Do you know what percentage of educational research has been replicated? And this is from I don't remember what the number of articles was, but it was from the leading educational journals. Somebody went into them and asked how many of these reports, how many of this research was replicated in any way. Because research without replication is not research. Does anybody want to humor me? I have this adolescent side to me. You've probably noticed it already. Does anybody want to humor me with a guess as to what percentage of educational research has been replicated? Has been replicated? North of 97? And you mean more than 97, okay? Anybody else want to? You think it's less than that? What do I hear 5%? 10%? So we've got 97 and 5%. You guys are extremists. I don't think I can handle this. I get to be moderate here. The answer is 0.13%. Which is to say, anytime somebody says to you, our school is research-based, they're either naive or lying. Or they might mean there's a different kind of research. Okay, so I mean CiRCE, it stands for Center for Independent Research on Classical Education. So we're into research. We try to find best practices. Here's what we found. They aren't being done now. They happened in the Middle Ages, they happened in the ancient world. You can find books that sort of hint at them, but you're going to have to work really hard to find them. Now, happily, that's an extreme statement. In degrees, these best practices are still being done. But here I go. I want to give you something very practical now. When we think of education at CiRCE, we think of it in 6 categories. There's 6, we call it the 6 dimensions of education. And they are, excuse me, at the top, the highest dimension, the most inclusive dimension, is the environment in which it takes place, the world you live in. Okay? There's not a lot you can do about that, except through education you can nourish it, you can, feed back into it. So education is the environment is the broadest context. Within the context of the environment, a community forms. So right here, under Mr. Luddy's leadership and Tim's leadership and a number of you that have formed this school, you've formed a community within an environment, right? You see that? Okay. Now that community has chosen among you, or at least has perhaps been chosen to follow certain people who are your leaders, who are your governance. Okay, so that's the third dimension. You have environment, community, governance. And that governance oversees the life of the institution. And the 3 elements of the life of the institution within the institution are curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Now, by curriculum, I'm talking about the path that the student walks. I don't mean books that they read only. I mean the journey that the student or the members of the community wander to get through. As I understand it, curriculum is a running track. It's what the horses ran on, right? So in the modern world, you have a curriculum, which is what the students are running on, and it's divided into subjects, which is Latin for throw under. So what we do is we get our kids running in circles so we can throw them under the bus. But we have the curriculum, and that's the path or the journey that the kids take. And then under that, we have pedagogy, which every student needs a pedagogue, a leader, somebody who's going to guide them on this journey. Okay, so there's a philosophy, a principle, a set of principles of how you should lead a child on this journey that you're sending them on. And then finally, there's assessment. Given that we are on this journey together, and we do have an objective, how are we going to know how we're doing? How are we going to know how my student is doing in the classroom? How are we going to know how the teachers or guides are doing? How are we going to know how the curriculum is working? How are we going to know how the governance is working? How are we going to know how the community itself is functioning? And how are we going to know how we're interacting with the environment? We need to know these things, and assessment helps us do that. But what if, well, the general principle now. If those 6, at least the bottom 5, ideally the 6, the top one, the environment too, but certainly the bottom 5, community, governance, curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. If those 5 dimensions are not working together in harmony, and I want you to hold that word really firmly in your mind, in harmony, if they're not working together, then they're not working together. That's a deep philosophical statement. Got it? If they're not working, I think that's called a tautology. If they're not working together, then they're in discord. And there will be stress and tension on the system. Now, what if you draw your pedagogical commitments from one school of thought, and you get your curriculum from a publisher with a different school of thought, and your assessment comes from the society around you, which is in a different philosophy? How well are those 3 things going to work together? Not terribly well is my suggestion for you. Now, to my mind, the most dangerous of those things, the most dangerous thing you can do to a school once you've established it, is to be careless about assessment. And to not think about, what was the first principle that we were supposed to learn from Hildebrand? It had to do with not independence instead of passive influences. I'm going to propose to you that right now in American education, assessment is a passive influence that we just accept. We don't think terribly hard about it, and we just accept it, and it doesn't fit what we're trying to do in the classical renewal. And this is why I get so excited. I consider it an incredible honor to stand before you this morning and address teachers. I assume there's some parents here too and some leadership, but to address a community of people who teach in a school that isn't accredited. Do you know what accreditation is? Do you understand? That's a means of assessment. Whoever assesses you is your boss. That's also really deep. Okay? Write that down and think about that. Whoever assesses you is your boss. Be careful who you choose to let lead you. Make sure that they have some sense of what you're trying to do and some understanding of how you intend to do it. If I wanted to destroy a school, I could do it pretty easily. This is my strategy. If I wanted to destroy a school, what I would do is I'd go into a board meeting and I'd say, this is a really good school. I'd take a great school, right? Like 220 kids, all of whom are straight A students, and all of them are trying to get in your classes, okay? 200, and most of them get accepted, and you're going, yes, okay. And I'd go into that school and I'd say, you know, you got a great school here. The only trouble is you need to measure things more carefully. And then I would create this system of measuring everything, reduce everything to numbers. Right? And you know what the most boards would do in America? They'd go, oh yeah, we got to get this accountable. We got to get this measurable. Why? Because what gets measured gets done, right? What gets measured gets done. Well, that's what you say, that's what you believe if you believe that. If you believe that knowledge is power, if you believe that knowledge can be reduced to control over adaptation to the environment, if you don't believe that knowledge is the perception of the truth by the soul, then you're stuck with things like measuring. You have to measure everything because that's the only certainty you can get, even though that's not a certainty. It makes you feel certain. But what if we go back to the tradition? There's this wonderful statement by this guy you might have heard of. His name was Socrates. Plato's writing about him, but who knows, maybe he was following the Pythagorean tradition where you actually have to memorize a whole conversation and then write it at the end of the day. You know, that's what they had to do. This was a spiritual discipline for the Pythagoreans. They'd listen to a dialogue, and at night they'd write it word for word. So maybe that's what Plato did in the Republic. Who knows? But anyway, this is what Socrates says in the Republic. What gets measured gets done. No, that's not what he said. What he said was, what is honored is cultivated, and that which has no honor is neglected. Because our culture doesn't believe in honor, real honor, I mean, again, sweeping generalization, we replace honor with numbers. And to get something, we propel people, we compel people to give it to us, because if they don't, they won't get the number they need to advance to the next stage, to get their raise, whatever it is. That's an industrial phrase, you know. That's a concept that comes from industry. What gets measured gets done. And it's true if your goal is to produce a very measurable quantitative product. In the days when, say, Frederick Winslow Taylor was promoting this philosophy, it would have been something like a pitchfork. Now it's an iPhone. iPhones are extraordinarily complex, but they're still digital. And I am one who thinks the revival of the vinyl music industry is a great thing. Analog. We live in an analog universe, not a digital universe. The digital side of things describes parts of it, measures it, but there's always these gaps. And people who listen to music really closely tell me that analog music is a different experience from digital music. Now, I can just pass that on. I don't have an ear for that. But Plato is saying that more important than quantitative measurement is honor. Because you see, that child, that teacher, that community, that parent, they have a hunger. They have a hunger in their soul for honor. And if you take that away, and if you take away their hope that they can attain honor, then you might get yourself a little Iliad. You might get yourself a little catastrophe, in fact. What we ought to be doing, if I can quote another member of the tradition from the ancient world, what we ought to be doing if we want to see high performance is not place our priority on performance. What we ought to be doing is outdoing one another in showing honor. That we ought to be studying day and night how we can honor other people. We talk in our culture about love languages. You've heard that term, the 5 love languages. I think it's a wonderful idea, but I would propose to you that it might work even better if we figured out not love languages, but honor languages. Call it honor codes if you want. That everybody has their own code of honor. Everybody has their own way of being honored. My wife, she's very quiet, very insightful, but very quiet, very hardworking, very intuitive about what needs to be done all the time. And it's harder for me to figure out, partly because I'm a man, exactly what is it that makes her, we say makes her tick, right? Well, what makes a person tick is honor. And if we want to see the kind of activities, the kind of, performance that we want to see in our students, teachers, parents, and community, then we need to be focusing not on measuring things, but on honoring things. And I'm not saying that nothing's measurable. There are certainly some things that are measurable. What I'm getting at, though, is that the obsession with measurement, what a great way to destroy a school. Because back to my story, I'd convinced the board that they should measure everything, and you teachers know it wouldn't take long for you to become totally discouraged. You would always be wondering, because there's too many things. It's like learning styles, right? Every 6 weeks there's a new learning style. There's a new discipline, new technique of teaching, right? I believe there's 2 modes of teaching, 2 ways to teach. There's mimetic teaching and Socratic teaching. And then I thought about that for a long time and realized actually it is just Socratic. or else it's just mimetic. They end up being the same thing. There's really only one way to teach. But I don't have time to get into that now. That's pedagogy. But if you spend all of your time drilling down and finding all the different ways that children learn, you'll get confused. You'll be asking yourself every 10 minutes, am I doing the right technique here? And you'll be going to a new workshop every 6 months. And by the way, there is great incentive for publishing companies to constantly come up with new techniques. Great incentives. I think one of the turning points in American education was in the 1950s, in 1951, in fact, when all these 5-year-olds started walking down the street to their school with their paper bag lunch in their hand, and they arrived on the school door, on the school door step, and they'd known they were coming for 5 years, but they forgot to prepare, and the baby boom hit the schools, and it hasn't recovered yet. The schools haven't recovered yet, because all of a sudden they needed to hire overnight 3 times as many teachers or whatever it was, a lot more teachers. So what did they do? Well, you can't just equip a teacher overnight, can you? You're professionals. You know it takes a long time to learn how to teach. Well, there's a solution. Textbooks. We'll use the textbook to teach the kids. And the best textbooks you'll ever find are probably from the 50s, because it was close enough to when teaching was well done by people that they had to imitate what people did. By the time you get to the 80s, though, people have been forgotten, and now the teacher is an administrator of information on behalf of a textbook publishing company. So what I'm getting at is the way we assess interferes with our pedagogy, interferes with our curriculum, interferes with our governance, and breaks down our communities. And we have to think about all 6 of those dimensions. Now, I said there was going to be something practical here. Maybe that'll be a little practical, but I also suggested in my description that I was going to talk about good stuff. I've been sitting here ripping on bad stuff. I'm sorry about that. I'm just a melancholic, negative kind of guy. But I'm going to try to spend 12 minutes being positive with you, because I do believe a turn took place. Notice those 2 words, scientia. Scientia means knowledge. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a wonderful thing. Potentia, good or bad? Can't do much without it, can you? It's a good thing. Both of them, however, are easily abused. Both of them need to be ordered to something higher. What do you order knowledge to that's higher than it if you want knowledge to be valuable, to be positive? What can knowledge help you develop? I would propose wisdom. And what about power? What can you use to regulate or fulfill power so that it does good things instead of bad? I would propose virtue. And there's the difference. In the ancient tradition, in the classical world, and I understand that, by the way, I'm sorry I missed your talk. It was traffic, honest, it was traffic. The Orient, too, makes a big deal. One of my favorite books is the Tao by Sun Tzu. They make a huge emphasis, they put a huge weight on wisdom and virtue. Everybody knows wisdom and virtue are needed. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows that knowledge and power make you dangerous, and that if they're not ordered ultimately toward wisdom and virtue, you're in trouble when you give people knowledge and power. But what we've lost, generally speaking, as a culture, is an agreed upon sense of what wisdom is, of what virtue is, and about how we get there. But that is precisely what the point of the classical curriculum was. There's a line in Quintilian that I wanted to read, and I didn't get it down. I thought of it while I was driving here, but there's in Quintilian, 1st century Roman author who outlines the classical curriculum, if you like, for the ancient world in more detail than anywhere else. It's 5 volumes in the Loeb. Quintilian says something like this, that you need to read Virgil and Homer, which of course we all take for granted. We all know that. You got to read Virgil and Homer. But he gives 3 reasons for it, and the one that stands out to me that I wanted to mention is that in Homer and Virgil there is a sublimity. There's a sublimity that the soul needs to feed on. I don't remember how Quintilian put it, but that word sublimity leapt off the page to me. When you don't believe in the soul, when you believe in nothing but the measurable, you lose your sense of the sublime. You lose the sense of the transcendent. But what else matters? What else matters? The thing that lifts our souls up, the thing that moves our soul, is the sublimity, the truths that enter it. And truth is always sublime, by the way. If I say to you 3 + 2 = 5, this is sublime. If all you do is memorize the fact, which is a little different, then it's practical, it's utility, right? Now you can add 3 + 2 = 5 + 2 = 7. Okay, now that's practical. But if you perceive the truth of 3 + 2 = 5, you're changed. Something happens in your soul. And we get distracted from that all the time, but what the tradition is constantly calling us to, whether we talk about Plato or Homer or Aristotle or Solomon or Thomas Aquinas or Erasmus, what they're constantly calling us to is a wisdom that is rooted in contemplation of the sublime. This is why the arts should never be, in my view, should never be, what's the word, extracurricular, voluntary. What are the arts teaching us? What are the arts cultivating in us? Perception. At the very lowest level, the arts teach us, the fine arts, painting, let's say, at the very lowest level, painting teaches us how to see. Teaches us how to look at things. I have a daughter who's a painter. I remember one time she was driving along and she came to an intersection and she sat there long after the light turned green, which of course, I got anxious and get moving. And she didn't notice that the light had turned green because she was staring at the way the light played on the yellows around it. So it does make you useless, but at the same time, it helps you to see. Okay, what does an author do? What makes an author so great? A storyteller, I mean. What makes a storyteller so great? They see things. They see things so well that they help us to see things. What makes music, a musician, so great a musician? Anybody who can sing well. One of the things I've noticed is that actors can often sing well, and people who sing well can often act well because they can hear so well. Quintilian, again, said there's two faculties that he looks at in his students right at the beginning to determine how successful might this person be. He says a teacher, one of the first things a teacher does when they look at a teacher is to, I'd say, size them up. What's his capacity? We have to. We can't ask them to do things they can't do. We also don't want to buttonhole them, or pigeonhole them, but we have to assess their readiness and their capacity. He says the first two things he looks for in a child, number one, memory. Memory. Number two, ability to imitate. Interesting that. We don't like imitation as a culture, largely because we don't understand what it is. But he says if you can memorize and you can imitate, you can learn. But don't go imitating, he specifically mentions creating laughter by imitating the way somebody walks. That's not what he's talking about. But although that is, if you can do that well, you might well grow up to become a comedian. But he doesn't want people disrespecting others. But the capacity to imitate is largely determinative of what a person can achieve in life. Michael Jordan could tell you the same thing. How did he get so good? He imitated great players. They all tell you that. So we need to be looking toward truth, toward wisdom, and toward virtue, not just toward utility. So I want, if I let's see, what do I have next? And I actually get more nervous with a slideshow than I do without because I never know what's up there. Oh yeah, okay, that's good. I wanted to talk to you about the 7 liberating arts, and I'll probably get through the definition and purpose. Let's see what happens. Okay, so there's the 7 liberating arts. First thing I want you to notice is there's 7 of them, but just briefly, because that distinguishes them from modern liberal arts, of which there's an infinite number, right? And then notice I changed that from liberal to liberating. I didn't do that for political reasons, I did that for emphasis. That these are arts that liberate us. These are arts that liberate us, okay? And how do they do that? Well, they're arts, you see. But what are they arts of, and what is an art? An art is a way of making something. In fact, an art is a way of making something other than itself, which makes fine art, which comes from finis, to end, sort of maybe self-contradictory, but liberating arts are arts that are used to make something other than themselves. So what do they make? Freedom. They make freedom, and they make knowledge. They make it possible to gain knowledge of truth, because truth sets you free. This is an ultimate principle, spiritual principle, but it's also an immediate principle. The child who knows the truth of the distributive property has now entered the realms of algebra. The child who only memorizes the formula of the distributive property will always be dependent, will always need you to tell him what formula to use, will always need you to think for him. But if he perceives with his soul the truth of the distributive property, wow, does he see it? He sees a new world. That's the love of learning. So they're the 7 liberating arts because they enable us, they equip us to perceive truth and to gain knowledge, to make knowledge, and therefore they set us free. And so I call them the 7 liberating arts because they equip us to do 3 things. Perceive the truth. That's the most important thing a soul does, perceive the truth. If you can't regulate your life by truth, what else is there? But also truth expression. Maybe I should have said embodiment. When you can use language well, not only can you use language in dialogue to perceive truth, but you can then express it, and that enables you to achieve this: harmony. Harmony. Now, one of the most exciting things for me in my reflections on the 7 liberal arts as the curriculum of the classical tradition is this notion of harmony. I talked already about the 6 dimensions. Did you notice I spoke of if they're not in harmony, then they are in discord, and if they're in discord, they don't work well together. This is the root of every intuition. I truly believe this. How many of you are moms? You've had a bunch of kids in your house, right? And you're talking with your friends, and then all of a sudden you know something's wrong. Nobody else does, but you know something's wrong. How do you know? Either a voice just went silent and you intuitively noticed that, or a new voice came in, or some kid is screaming and men don't notice that sort of thing. But you have a discord. Something broke into the harmony that you were perceiving, the normal way of that being, and now there's a breakdown, and you know, you're a teacher. You've got a classroom full of kids. You've got a classroom full of students, and you're discussing some issue with them. And something happens, and you just know, you just feel in your bones that off to your left, one of the students is confused. That's not something you can teach. That's something you feel, because you're always feeling for the harmony. Now, the worst thing we do to our teachers in our culture is we train them with techniques so much that they can't feel the harmonies in the classroom. And if they don't feel the harmonies, if they don't value the harmonies, how are they going to feel the discords? It's always discord, right? You've always got these kids whose minds are going off in different directions, and you got to pin them down on their desk for 45 minutes or 52 minutes so that they can function under your dominion for 52 minutes, right? That's not teaching. Teaching is when we align our souls with our students. And what we're trying to do, therefore, is always to achieve harmony. I want to look at this very, very briefly, because there's another factor here that's important under arithmetic, and I think I can illustrate the point for all 7 with just arithmetic. In arithmetic, fundamentally what a child is learning how to do is harmonize numbers. If I say 3 plus 2 equals 6, if you're healthy, you feel stressed out now. Okay, so then I say 3 plus 2 equals 6 minus 1. And now you have resolution. It's musical, you see. It's like a sonata. You feel the tension, you feel the discord, and then there's the joy of harmony. It's a joke, right? That's what jokes do. The difference with a joke is that if you know the answer, you fill in the blank. So jokes are a demonstration of how the soul is always seeking harmony, if I can put it that way. So in arithmetic, we're harmonizing numbers. But notice something. If I'm doing that, I'm practicing harmonizing my thoughts. In a very small way, I'm practicing bringing harmony to my thoughts. And that means my mind. Now, how many of you think that it's healthier to have a discordant, disjunctive mind? And how many of you think it's healthier to have a harmonizing mind? In the ancients, Plato, Pythagoras, when they studied arithmetic, it wasn't for practical benefits, although those certainly arose. It was to heal the soul. And how do you heal the soul? By bringing harmony. This is a very, very practical thing, by the way, mental health. So, by learning arithmetic in a way that perceives the truth of numbers and their relations to each other, you are bringing harmony into the mind. And from the mind, you can then bring harmony into the world around you. Now, the next, as you can imagine, 6 slides are the other arts, and I don't have time to go into them, so I want to jump all the way to the end and say that in rhetoric, I asked myself, what does each of the arts harmonize? And I got to rhetoric. Grammar harmonizes, let's just say, words with each other. Logic harmonizes propositions with each other. Okay, what does rhetoric harmonize? Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, doesn't harmonize anything, but that's not what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is the art of finding all the available means of persuasion, and that's presented to us in an ethical context. I'm going to propose to you that the purpose of rhetoric is to bring harmony to the community. And the way you do that in rhetoric, especially Aristotelian and classical rhetoric, the way you do that is not by teaching kids how to build a good argument, but by how to make a decision together. I look to Homer more for rhetoric than I do to Aristotle, by the way. I believe that when you are studying rhetoric, what you're teaching children to do, what you're teaching people how to do, is to make decisions together in community. And if you don't make decisions together and you don't learn how to make decisions together, you're not going to have a harmony. And by the way, if you spend 12 years in school and all those years are spent empowering students to be different from each other, to get their own, when they graduate, they won't be skilled at bringing harmony to their communities. And a community that is not working together to strive at least for harmony is not a community that's going to be free for very long. We can impact our communities, but not through power. We can impact our communities not by grabbing onto means of influence and forcing them to think certain ways and do things we want them to do through legal or other means. But we can influence them through the quiet, humble, reverential cultivation of the child's soul by teaching him how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, by teaching him how to measure shapes in their relations to each other, by teaching him how to perceive the forms and structures of music, by teaching him how to use words, how to use propositions, and how to make decisions together in community. We can have a quiet influence, soul to soul, that can nourish the community we're a part of. And I want to challenge you, therefore, as you look at the curriculum and as you think of the quest for truth that we've already been challenged to pursue. Remember that the soul hungers above all for 2 things. Rationally, let's say, it hungers for harmony. And spiritually, perhaps, socially, it hungers for honor. Guide your children on the path to harmony and give them the honor they deserve when they deserve it, and you'll see the kind of transformation that we can achieve and that's worth achieving. Knowledge is power. But that's not what we need. We need wisdom and virtue. Thank you.